Welcome, friends. Today let's talk about Kant's aesthetics and teleology. Kant's views on aesthetics and teleology are most fully presented in his Critique of Judgment, Kritik der Urteilskraft, now often translated Critique of the Power of Judgment, published in 1790. This work is in two parts, preceded by a long introduction in which Kant explains and defends the work's importance to his critical system overall. In the first part, the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, Kant discusses aesthetic experience and judgment, in particular of the beautiful and the sublime, and also artistic creation. In the second part, the Critique of Teleological Judgment, he discusses the role of teleology, that is, appeal to ends, purposes or goals, in natural science and in our understanding of nature more generally. The Critique of Judgment was the third and last of Kant's three critiques, the other two being the Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, with a second edition in 1787, which deals with metaphysics and epistemology, and the Critique of Practical Reason of 1788, which, alongside his groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals of 1785, deals with ethics. Although interest in the critique of judgment has increased substantially over the last several decades, it has received less attention than the other two critiques. One reason is that the areas of aesthetics and natural teleology have traditionally been considered less philosophically central than those of ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. Another is that it raises an interpretive problem which has no analogue in the case of the other critiques. That is, how to make sense of the work as a whole, given the seeming disparity of the two parts, not only with each other, but also with the faculty of judgment, which is the work's ostensible focus. However, Kant's aesthetic theory has always been extremely influential within philosophical aesthetics and the philosophy of art. And since the late 1970s, there has been a rapidly expanding literature on Kant's aesthetics within Anglo-American Kant interpretation. Some of the growth in the literature up to 2008 is documented in Gaia 2009. Kant's views on natural teleology, very much neglected in comparison to his aesthetics, started to receive more attention in the early 1990s, and there has been increased interest during the last 2 decades in particular, both in Kant's view of teleology in its own right and in its potential relevance to contemporary philosophy of biology and to other areas in philosophy. Moreover, again since the 1990s, more attention has been directed towards the project of interpreting the critique of judgment as a coherent whole. With increased focus on its general philosophical underpinnings, the third critique has come to be seen not only as significant within the disciplines of aesthetics and philosophy of biology, but also as playing an important systematic role with respect to Kant's epistemology, metaphysics and ethics, and indeed, as relevant to contemporary discussions in these and related areas. Kant's aesthetics and teleology together comprise a very wide field, and this article cannot cover all the relevant topics, nor take account of all the relevant literature, especially given the recent expansion of scholarly interest in the third critique. I mention here 3 more specific limitations. First, although Kant wrote on aesthetics and teleology throughout his career, this article considers only Kant's Critique of Judgment, along with the so-called First Introduction, an earlier version of the introduction that was not published during Kant's lifetime, but that is included with the most recent English translations of the Critique of Judgment. Second, this article is concerned primarily with the interpretive and philosophical issues raised by Kant's writings on these topics, as opposed to historical questions regarding their origin and reception. Third, the article focuses primarily on those issues that have attracted most attention in the Anglo-American analytic tradition. This is reflected in the bibliography, which is largely restricted to works in English and more specifically works written from an analytic perspective. The faculty of judgment and the unity of the third critique. Kant's account of aesthetics and teleology is ostensibly part of a broader discussion of the faculty or power of judgment, Urteilskraft, which is the faculty for thinking the particular under the universal. Introduction 4, 179. Although the critique of pure reason includes some discussion of the faculty of judgment, defined as the capacity to subsume under rules, that is, to distinguish whether something falls under a given rule, A132, B171, it is not until the critique of judgment that he treats judgment as a full-fledged faculty in its own right, with its own a priori principle, and accordingly requiring a critique to determine its scope and limits. Kant describes judgment in the Critique of Judgment as having two roles or aspects: determining and bestimmend, and reflecting, reflektierend. Introduction of 4, 179, and FI 5, 2211. Judgment in its determining role subsumes given particulars under concepts or universals which are themselves already given. This role coincides with the role assigned to the faculty of judgment in the Critique of Pure Reason. It also appears to correspond to the activity of imagination in its schematism of concepts. Judgment in this role does not operate as an independent faculty, but is instead governed by principles of the understanding. The more distinctive role assigned to judgment in the Critique of Judgment is the reflecting role, that of finding the universal for the given particular. Introduction 4, 179. Kant's recognition of judgment as a faculty in its own right, and hence of the need for a critique not just for theoretical and practical reason but also for judgment, appears to be connected with his ascription to judgment of a reflecting, in addition to a merely determining role, judgment as reflecting, or reflective judgment, reflektierende Urteilskraft, is assigned various different roles within Kant's system. Kant describes it as responsible for various cognitive tasks associated with empirical scientific inquiry, in particular, the classification of natural things into a hierarchical taxonomy of genera and species, and the construction of systematic, explanatory scientific theories. Kant also suggests that it has a more fundamental role to play in making cognition possible, in particular, that it enables us to regard nature as empirically law-like, see especially Introduction 5, 184, and, even more fundamentally, that it is responsible for the formation of all empirical concepts, see especially FI 5, 2211-213. But reflective judgment is also described as responsible for two specific kinds of judgments: aesthetic judgments, judgments about the beautiful and the sublime, and teleological judgments, judgments which ascribe ends or purposes to natural things, or which characterize them in purposive or functional terms. These, along with associated topics, are discussed respectively in Section 1, the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, and Section 2, the Critique of Teleological Judgment. The discussion of the role of judgment in empirical scientific inquiry is confined to a few sections of the introduction and first introduction. Although reflective judgment is exercised in both aesthetic and teleological judgment, Kant assigns a special role to its exercise in the aesthetic case, and specifically in judgments of beauty. Introduction 8, 193, FI 4, 243-244. More specifically, he says, it is in judgments of beauty, as opposed to the sublime, and even more specifically, judgments about the beauty of nature, as opposed to art, that judgment reveals itself as a faculty that has its own special principle. 244. The especially close connection between judgments of beauty and the faculty of judgment is reflected in Kant's view that the feeling of pleasure in a beautiful object is felt in virtue of an exercise of reflective judgment. Introduction 7. FI 8. Much of Kant's aesthetics and theory of teleology is developed without any explicit reference to the faculty of judgment, and the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment makes no mention of reflective judgment as it figures in empirical, scientific inquiry. In fact, the term reflective judgment does not appear in the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment at all. The only suggestion in the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment of an important role for the faculty of judgment in Kant's aesthetics is in the deduction of taste, where he describes the principle of taste as the subjective principle of judgment in general, paragraph 35, 286, and suggests that the relation of aesthetic judgment specifically to the faculty of judgment in general is crucial for the legitimacy of judgments of beauty, paragraph 38, 290. Accordingly, much of the secondary literature on Kant's aesthetics has treated it in isolation from the more general account of judgment in which it is embedded, and the same is true, perhaps to an even greater extent, in the case of Kant's teleology. Conversely, discussions of Kant's theory of judgment have typically taken little or no account of Kant's treatment of judgment in the third critique, suggesting thereby that Kant's views on judgment are exhausted by his account of cognitive, in particular non-aesthetic, judgments in the Critique of Pure Reason and the Logic. The article Kant's Theory of Judgment in the Present Encyclopedia, Hanna 2004, 2018, is one example. However, since the late 1980s, philosophers working on Kant have become increasingly interested in the notion of judgment in the third critique. One way in which this interest has been pursued is through an exploration of the relation of Kant's notion of judgment in the third critique to his account of cognition in the Critique of Pure Reason and the Logic. Longueness, 1993-1998, maintains that there is a close connection between the capacity to judge, Vermögen zu urteilen, in that work, and the faculty of judgment in the Critique of Judgment, a connection which she summarizes by describing the faculty of judgment as the actualization of the capacity to judge in relation to sensory perceptions, 1993-1998, 8. According to Longueness, the activity of reflective judgment corresponds to the comparison, reflection, and abstraction which Kant describes in the Logic, paragraph 6, 994-95, as responsible for the formation of empirical concepts, and which she understands as, in turn, a necessary condition of the application of the pure concepts of understanding to the manifold of sensible intuition, 1993, 1998, 163, 166, and 195, 197. Longueness's view on this point is endorsed and elaborated in Allison 2001. Chapter 1. Another manifestation of interest in the notion of judgment has been the exploration of connections between Kant's account of aesthetic experience and judgment in the third critique and his theory of cognitive judgments in the first critique. Bell, 1987, and Ginsburg, 1990a, both argue that for Kant, the possibility of aesthetic experience to be, in some sense, a condition of the possibility of cognitive judgment. Mackreel, 1990, from a more continental and specifically hermeneutical perspective, also argues for deep connections between Kant's aesthetics and his account of cognition. Kukla, 2006, collects together a number of essays exploring the relation between Kant's aesthetics and his theory of cognition. The introduction to Kukla, 2006, offers some historical perspective on the increased interest in Kant's aesthetics as playing a systematic role in Kant's epistemological program. Hughes, 2007, Shade 5, argues that Kant's views in the Critique of Judgment are necessary for a full understanding of Kant's account of synthesis in the first critique, and for the transcendental deduction of the categories in the first critique. Ginsburg, 2006, and Geiger, 2020, both argue for a connection between the possibility of aesthetic judgment and that of the acquisition of empirical concepts. Breitenbach, 2021, proposes that aesthetic judgment and cognitive judgment share a common core of imaginative reflection which helps account for scientific creativity. Mackay, 2021, Shu 1, while sympathetic to the idea that Kant's aesthetics makes a contribution to his view of cognition, argues that several attempts to make out the connection, including those of Bell, 1987, and Allison, 2001, rest on a mistaken construal of Kant's notion of judgment. Rather than endorsing the idea that aesthetic judgment is somehow presupposed by cognition, she proposes that they are parallel, both having a basis in reflective judgment, Mackay 2021, Kant 4. An important reason why commentators have been interested in Kant's account of judgment in the Critique of Judgment is as a potential solution to the question of what unifies the various parts of the Critique of Judgment, and in particular, what connects the discussion of aesthetics in the first half of the book with that of teleology in the second half of the book. Until the 1980s, many commentators were skeptical that there was any real philosophical connection between the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, Part 1, and the Critique of Teleological Judgment, Part 2. For expressions of this view, see for example Schopenhauer, 1890, 1859, 1969, Volume I, 531, Mark Vogel, 1938, 34n, and Beck, 1969, 497. But since then, there has been much more interest in understanding the work as a unified whole, where this involves recognizing connections not only between the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment and the Critique of Teleological Judgment, but also between those two sections and the introduction and first introduction to the Critique of Judgment as a whole. The decision by the editors of the present encyclopedia to treat the seemingly disparate topics of Kant's aesthetics and Kant's teleology in a single article represents one illustration of this general orientation towards the unity of the work. One way in which commentators have tried to find unity in the Critique of Judgment is by connecting Kant's aesthetics with his discussions in the introduction and first introduction of the search for a system of empirical concepts and laws. Examples of this approach include Ginzburg, 1990a, Hughes, 2007, Zuckert, 2007a, and Geiger, 2020. Another, potentially complementary way is to find connections between his theory of beauty and his views on biology in the Critique of Teleological Judgment. Zumbach, 1984, 51, 53, suggests that works of art are analogous to organisms. Mackreel, 1990, Kant 5, sees the connection as turning on the idea of pleasure as the feeling of mental life. Aquila, 1992, draws a connection between the internal structure of organisms as one in which the whole determines the parts, and the internal structure of a judgment of beauty as one in which a feeling of pleasure rather than a concept serves as a predicate. Ginzburg, 1997a, connects Kant's aesthetics and his biological views in terms of the idea of purposiveness construed as normativity. The normativity in the functioning of organisms parallels the normative claim to universal agreement made by a judgment of beauty. Zuckert, 2007a, offers an especially detailed account of the connection, also emphasizing the notion of purposiveness, but construing it as unity in diversity, which is manifested in beautiful objects and organisms alike. Geiger, 2020, suggests that organisms play a special role as objects of aesthetic judgment, and suggests that our aesthetic judgments about organisms are closely allied to our sorting of nature into kinds, and hence our acquisition of empirical concepts. A contrasting approach to the unity of the Critique of Judgment goes by way of Kant's moral teleology, and invokes Kant's claim that the Critique of Judgment is intended to bridge the gulf between nature and freedom. Introduction 2 and 3, 175, 127. This approach is implicit in many discussions of the relevance of Kant's aesthetics to his account of morality, see section 2.8, which in turn can be connected to his theory of teleology through the idea that the human being, as a free and rational agent, is the ultimate purpose, Endzweck of nature, see section 3.6. Gardner, 2016, offers an explicit defense of this kind of approach, drawing on the idea that aesthetic experience reveals the suitability of nature for human moral agency. This idea is also emphasized in Wicks, 2007. Saville, 2021, invokes a related idea and ascribes it to Kant under the label of aesthetic humanism. Vaccarino Bremner, forthcoming, develops this kind of approach in detail by focusing on Kant's idea of culture, which Kant identifies as the ultimate purpose, letzter Zweck of nature, 5429, and which, on her view, mediates between nature itself and the final purpose, Zweck of nature, that is, the human being as a moral agent. The theme of the unity of the critique of judgment is closely related to that of the role of the critique of judgment in Kant's overall philosophical system. Pollock, 2017, Chapter 9, offers some brief but suggestive remarks on that topic. Hussein Zadigan, 2018, addresses both the internal unity of the critique of judgment and its relation to Kant's opus posthumum. Aesthetics. An aesthetic judgment, in Kant's usage, is a judgment which is based on feeling, and in particular on the feeling of pleasure or displeasure. According to Kant's official view, there are three kinds of aesthetic judgment: judgments of the agreeable, judgments of beauty, or equivalently, judgments of taste, and judgments of the sublime. However, Kant often uses the expression aesthetic judgment in a narrower sense which excludes judgments of the agreeable, and it is with aesthetic judgments in this narrower sense that the critique of aesthetic judgment is primarily concerned. Such judgments can either be, or fail to, be pure. While Kant mostly focuses on the ones which are pure, there are reasons to think that most judgments about art, as opposed to nature, do not count as pure, so that it is important to understand Kant's views on such judgments as well. The critique of aesthetic judgment is concerned not only with judgments of the beautiful and the sublime, but also with the production of objects about which such judgments are appropriately made. This topic is discussed under the headings of fine art, or beautiful art, schöne Kunst, and genius. The most distinctive part of Kant's aesthetic theory, and the part which has aroused most interest among commentators, is his account of judgments of beauty, and more specifically pure judgments of beauty. Following Kant's own usage, the expression judgment of beauty without qualification will refer in what follows to pure judgments of beauty. The most important elements of this account are sketched here in section 2.1 and section 2.2, and which correspond roughly to the analytic of the beautiful and the deduction of pure aesthetic judgments, respectively. Section 2.3 and section 2.4 are concerned, respectively, with interpretative issues that have arisen in connection with the account and with criticisms which have been made of it. Other elements of Kant's theory are sketched in the remainder of the section. Section 2.5 is concerned with judgments of beauty that are not pure, in particular judgments of adherent as opposed to free beauty. Section 2.6 with beautiful, art and genius. Section 2.7 with judgments of the sublime. Section 2.8 with the relation between aesthetics and morality, and section 2.9 with other implications of Kant's aesthetic theory. What is a judgment of beauty? The first section of the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, the Analytic of the Beautiful, aims to analyze the notion of a judgment of beauty or judgment of taste, describing the features which distinguish judgments of beauty from judgments of other kinds, notably cognitive judgments, which include judgments ascribing goodness to things, and what he calls judgments of the agreeable. Kant is not explicit about the pre-theoretical conception of judgments of beauty which is the subject of his analysis, and there is room for controversy about what does and does not count as a judgment of beauty in Kant's sense. Not every predicative use of the word beautiful signals the making of a judgment of beauty, at least in the paradigmatic sense with which Kant is concerned. For a useful discussion, see Saville, 1993, Shouts 1. For example, at first rate, Kant denies that the judgment that roses in general are beautiful is a judgment of beauty or judgment of taste proper. It is not an aesthetic, but an aesthetically grounded, logical judgment. There is also room for debate about whether the intuitive notion of a judgment of beauty for Kant allows for negative judgments of beauty. See section 2.3.6 below. However, at a first approximation, we can say that it is the mental activity or content typically expressed by or manifested in a sincere utterance of "that's beautiful," in reference to a perceptually presented object. Kant analyses the notion of a judgment of beauty by considering it under four headings or moments, as sketched below. 1.1. First moment, paragraph 1.5. Judgments of beauty are based on feeling, in particular feelings of pleasure. Kant also mentions displeasure, but this does not figure prominently in his account. For more on this point, see section 2.3.6 below. The pleasure, however, is of a distinctive kind. It is disinterested, which means that it does not depend on the subject's having a desire for the object, nor does it generate such a desire. The fact that judgments of beauty are based on feeling, rather than objective sensation, e.g., the sensation of a thing's color, distinguishes them from cognitive judgments based on perception, e.g., the judgment that a thing is green. But the disinterested character of the feeling distinguishes them from other judgments based on feeling. In particular, it distinguishes them from judgments of the agreeable, which are the kind of judgment expressed by saying simply that one likes something or finds it pleasing, for example, food or drink, and judgments of the good, including judgments both about the moral goodness of something and about its goodness for particular non-moral purposes. 1.2. Second moment, paragraph 6-9. Judgments of beauty have or make a claim to universality or universal validity. Kant also uses the expression universal communicability. This has been taken by many commentators as equivalent to universal validity, but recently this has been questioned. See section 2.3.8. That is, in making a judgment of beauty about an object, one takes it that everyone else who perceives the object ought also to judge it to be beautiful, and, relatedly, to share one's pleasure in it. But the universality is not based on concepts. That is, one's claim to agreement doesn't rest on the subsumption of the object under a concept, in the way, for example, that the claim to agreement made by the judgment that something is green rests on the ascription to the object of the property of being green, and hence its subsumption under the concept green. It follows from this that judgments of beauty cannot, despite their universal validity, be proved. There are no rules by which someone can be compelled to judge that something is beautiful. Kant expands on this point in paragraph 32-33. More strongly, judgments of beauty are not to be understood as predicating the concept beauty of their objects. As he puts it later, beauty is not a concept of the object. Paragraph 38-90. Still later, in the antinomy of taste, Kant seems to go back on this strong claim by saying that a judgment of beauty rests on an indeterminate concept. Paragraph 57-341. However, by concept here, he diverges from the standard use of the term concept as referring to a kind of representation which can figure in cognition. The fact that judgments of beauty are universally valid constitutes a further feature, in addition to the disinterestedness of the pleasure on which they are based, distinguishing them from judgments of agreeable. For in claiming simply that one likes something, one does not claim that everyone else ought to like it too. But the fact that their universal validity is not based on concepts distinguishes judgments of beauty from non-evaluative cognitive judgments and judgments of the good, both of which make a claim to universal validity that is based on concepts. 1.3. Third moment, paragraph 10-17. Unlike judgments of the good, judgments of the beautiful do not presuppose an end or purpose, Zweck, which the object is taken to satisfy. This is closely related to the point that their universality is not based on concepts. However, they nonetheless involve the representation of what Kant calls purposiveness, Zweckmäßigkeit. Because this representation of purposiveness does not involve the ascription of an purpose, in an expression widely used by commentators, it is purposiveness without a purpose. Kant calls the purposiveness which is represented merely formal purposiveness, or the form of purposiveness. He describes it as perceived both in the object itself and in the activity of imagination and understanding in their engagement with the object. For more on this activity, see the discussion of the free play of the faculties in section 2.2. For more on the notion of purposiveness, see section 3.1. The third moment, in particular, paragraph 14, is the main evidence for Kant's supposed formalism in aesthetics. For more on Kant's formalism, see section 2.4.2.1.4, fourth moment, paragraph 18 to 22. Judgments of beauty involve reference to the idea of necessity in the following sense. In taking my judgment of taste to be universally valid, I take it, not that everyone who perceives the object will share my pleasure in it and, relatedly, agree with my judgment, but that everyone ought to do so. I take it, then, that my pleasure stands in a necessary relation to the object which elicits it, where the necessity here can be described, though Kant himself does not use the term, as normative. But, as in the case of universal validity, the necessity is not based on concepts or rules, at least not concepts or rules that are determinate, that is, of a kind which figure in cognition. As noted earlier in this section, Kant describes it in the antinomy of taste as resting on an indeterminate concept. Kant characterizes the necessity more positively by saying that it is exemplary, in the sense that one's judgment itself serves as an example of how everyone ought to judge, paragraph 18, 237. He also says that it is based on a common sense, sensus communis, defined as a subjective principle, which allows us to judge by feeling rather than concepts. 20. How are judgments of beauty possible? Running through Kant's various characterizations of judgments of beauty is a basic dichotomy between two apparently opposed sets of features. On the one hand, judgments of beauty are based on feeling. They do not depend on subsuming the object under a concept, in particular, the concept of a purpose that such an object is supposed to satisfy, and they cannot be proved. This combination of features seems to suggest that judgments of beauty should be assimilated to judgments of the agreeable. On the other hand, however, judgments of beauty are unlike judgments of the agreeable in not involving desire for the object. More importantly and centrally, they make a normative claim to everyone's agreement. These features seem to suggest that they should be assimilated instead to objective cognitive judgments. In claiming that judgments of beauty have both sets of features, Kant can be seen as reacting equally against the two main opposing traditions. In 18th century aesthetics, the empiricist tradition of aesthetics represented by Hume, Hutcheson and Burke, on which a judgment of taste is an expression of feeling without cognitive content, and the rationalist tradition of aesthetics represented by Baumgarten and Meyer, on which a judgment of taste consists in the cognition of an object as having an objective property. Kant's insistence that there is an alternative to these two views, one on which judgments of beauty are both based on feeling and make a claim to universal validity, is probably the most distinctive aspect of his aesthetic theory. But this insistence confronts him with the obvious problem of how the two features, or sets of features, are to be reconciled. As Kant puts it, how is a judgment possible which, merely from one's own feeling of pleasure in an object, independent of its concept, judges this pleasure as attached to the representation of the same object in every other subject, and does so a priori, i.e., without having to wait for the assent of others? 36. 288. The argument constituting Kant's official answer to this question, the deduction of taste, is presented in the section entitled Deduction of Pure Aesthetic Judgments, in particular in sections paragraph 31 to 39, with the core of the argument given at paragraph 38. It is also prefigured in the Analytic of the Beautiful, in particular at paragraph 9 and paragraph 22, although the argument of paragraph 22, which appeals to the notion of a common sense, takes a somewhat different form from the presentation in the deduction of taste proper. The argument in all of its appearances relies on the claim introduced in paragraph 9 that pleasure in the beautiful depends on the free play or free harmony of the faculties of imagination and understanding. In the Critique of Pure Reason, imagination is described as synthesizing the manifold of intuition under the governance of rules that are prescribed by the understanding. The outcome of this is cognitive perceptual experience of objects as having specific empirical features. The rules prescribed by the understanding are, or correspond to, particular concepts that are applied to the object. For example, when a manifold is synthesized in accordance with the concepts green and square, the outcome is a perceptual experience in which the object is perceived as green and square. But now, in the Critique of Judgment, Kant suggests that imagination and understanding can stand in a different kind of relationship, one in which imagination's activity harmonizes with the understanding, but without imagination's being constrained or governed by understanding. In this relationship, imagination and understanding, in effect, do what is ordinarily involved in the bringing of objects under concepts, and hence in the perception of objects as having empirical features. But they do this without bringing the object under any concept in particular. So, rather than perceiving the object as green or square, the subject whose faculties are in free play responds to it perceptually with a state of mind which is non-conceptual, and specifically a feeling of disinterested pleasure. It is this kind of pleasure which is the basis for a judgment of taste. Kant appeals to this account of pleasure in the beautiful in order to argue for its universal validity or universal communicability. To argue, that is, that a subject who feels such a pleasure and thus judges the object to be beautiful is entitled to demand that everyone else feel a corresponding pleasure and thus agree with her judgment of taste. For, he claims, the free play of the faculties manifests the subjective condition of cognition in general. See, for example, paragraph 9, 218, 21, 238, power 38, 2090. We are entitled to claim that everyone ought to agree with our cognitions. For example, if I perceptually cognize an object as being green and square, I'm entitled to claim that everyone else ought to cognize it as green and square. But in order for this demand for agreement to be possible, he suggests, it must also be possible for me to demand universal agreement for the subjective condition of such cognitions. If I can take it that everyone ought to share my cognition of an object as green or square, then I must also be entitled to take it that everyone ought to share a perception of the object in which my faculties are in free play. Since the free play is no more than a manifestation of what is in general required for an object's being cognized as green or square in the first place, the most serious objection to the argument can be put in the form of a dilemma. See, for example, Gaia, 1979, 1997, 264, Miyabota, 1982, 81 Nafraf, Allison, 2001, 184, 192, Rind, 2002. Either the free play of the faculties is involved in all cognitive perceptual experience, or it is not. If it is, then it would seem, counterintuitively, that every object should be perceived as beautiful. Because of this consequence of grasping the first horn, the dilemma is sometimes characterized instead as Kant's everything is beautiful problem. But if it is not, then the central inference does not seem to go through. From the fact that I can demand agreement for the state of my faculties in experiencing an object as, say, green or square, it does not follow that I can demand agreement for a state in which my faculties are in free play, since the possibility of experiencing the free play would seem to require something over and above what is required for cognition alone. Most defenders of the argument have grasped the second horn of the dilemma. One such defense, originally proposed by Emmerich in his 1982, subsequently incorporated into Emmerich's 2003, relies on an understanding of judgments of taste as objective, and hence as making a claim to universal agreement, which is akin to that made by cognitive judgments. For more on the objectivity of taste, see section 2.3.5. Another, offered by Allison, rejects the objection as presupposing an overly strong interpretation of what the deduction is intended to accomplish. The objection tells against the deduction only if it is construed as entitling us to claim universal agreement for particular judgments of taste. But, as Allison reads it, the deduction is intended only to establish that such claims can, in general, be legitimate. Allison, 2001, Schoen 8. See especially 177-179. A similar position is taken by Kalar, 2006, 134. However, some commentators have taken this kind of defense to be inadequate, holding that the argument must establish not only a general entitlement to demand agreement for judgments of beauty, but an entitlement in each particular case. Saville, 1987, Chignell, 2007. Another, less commonly accepted option for defending the argument would be to grasp the first horn, accepting that on Kant's account, every object can legitimately be judged to be beautiful. Grasik, 1986, argues, independently of the argument of the deduction, that this is Kant's view, and it might also be noted that if judgments of beauty are not objective, there can be no feature of an object which rules it out as a candidate for being legitimately found beautiful. Commentators who emphasize this point include Ginsburg, 2017, and Breitenbach, 2021. A number of commentators have taken the dilemma or considerations related to it to be fatal to Kant's view that judgments of beauty make a legitimate claim to universal validity. See, for example, Mirboter 1982 cited above, and Gaia 1979, 284-288. Although Gaia offers a more positive assessment, see his 2003b, 60 and 15. Others have argued that Kant's view can be saved by drawing on considerations not mentioned in the official argument of the deduction. As noted below, section 2.8, Kant draws a close connection between our capacity for aesthetic judgment and our nature as moral beings. And even though Kant himself does not appeal to this connection in the deduction of taste, some commentators, including Eliot, 1968, Crawford, 1974, Kamal, 1986, and Saville, 1987, have taken moral considerations to constitute the ultimate ground of the legitimacy of judgments of beauty. Another strategy drawing on considerations outside the deduction itself has been to appeal to Kant's theory of aesthetic ideas, see section 2.6, which is ostensibly part of his theory of art, rather than his core theory of taste. This strategy is adopted in Saville 1987 and Chignell 2007. Chignell's view differs from Saville's in that it does not make any appeal to moral considerations. Finally, some commentators have held that while the argument of the official deduction at power 38 is unsuccessful in avoiding the dilemma, the version of the argument offered at power 21, which appeals to the notion of a common sense, is more effective. See in particular Rind, 2002, and Kalar, 2006, Categorical 5. The assessment of the objection, and of Kant's deduction of taste more generally, is complicated by a number of more fundamental interpretive issues, which are discussed in the next section. Judgments of beauty. Interpretive issues. This section describes 8 issues which have arisen in connection with Kant's account of pure judgments of taste, and which are relevant to the assessment of his argument for the possibility of such judgments. Although these issues are central to understanding the core of Kant's view, readers seeking a more general survey of Kant's aesthetics can omit this section. Triptych 1. Pleasure and judgment. What is the relation between the pleasure which is felt in an object experienced as beautiful and the judgment that the object is beautiful, that is, the judgment of taste? Kant describes the judgment of taste as based on a feeling of pleasure, and as claiming that everyone ought to share the subject's feeling of pleasure, or, as he puts it, as claiming the universal communicability of the pleasure. This seems to imply that the pleasure is distinct from the act of judging, and more specifically, that the pleasure precedes the judging. We first feel pleasure, and then claim, perhaps based on characteristics of the pleasure, such as its disinterestedness, that the pleasure is universally communicable, and hence that the object is beautiful. But in the crucial section Ferber 9 of the Critique of Judgment, Kant appears to reject that implication. Rather than the pleasure preceding the judging, he says, the merely subjective aesthetic judging of the object both precedes and is the ground of the pleasure. 218. Since Ferber 9 is specifically addressed to the issue whether in a judgment of taste the feeling of pleasure precedes the judging of the object or the judging precedes the pleasure, a problem whose answer is the key to the critique of taste, and hence deserves full attention. 216. Commentators have taken very seriously the task of reconciling Ferber 9 with Kant's other characterizations of the judgment of taste. There has been much discussion, beginning in the 1970s, of this basics issue. Donald Crawford addressed the apparent paradox by distinguishing the judging of the object which, according to Ferber 9, precedes the pleasure in it, from the judgment of taste proper, which is based on the pleasure, 1974, 69-74. A very influential approach along these lines was developed in detail by Geyer, 1979, who draws on passages elsewhere in the text to defend the view that a judgment of taste results from two distinct acts of reflective judgment, the first identifiable with the free play of the faculties and resulting in a feeling of pleasure, the second an act of reflection on the pleasure which results in the claim that the pleasure is universally communicable. See especially 97, 105 and 133, 141. A difficulty with that approach, however, recognized by Geyer, is that it conflicts with another passage at Ferber 9, in which Kant describes the pleasure as consequent on the universal communicability of the subject's mental state in the given representation, Ferber 9, 5-17. This implies that the act of judging which precedes the pleasure must be one in which the subject takes her state of mind to be universally communicable, requiring us to identify it with the judgment of taste proper, rather than with an activity of the faculties prior to that judgment. An alternative approach to Ferber 9, which attempts to accommodate the problematic passage without emendation, was offered in Ginsburg 1991. On this one-act approach, the act of judging something to be beautiful is a single self-referential act of judging which claims its own universal validity with respect to the object, and which is phenomenologically manifested as a feeling of pleasure. The free play of the faculties on this approach is identical with the judging of the object to be beautiful, and in turn with the feeling of pleasure. The pleasure does not precede the judging of the object to be beautiful, and is consequent on it only in the sense that we feel pleasure in virtue of the judgment. In its identification of the pleasure and the judgment, the view is like that of Aquila, 1982, see especially 107, and more recently Wicks, 2007, 43-45, although neither Aquila nor Wicks explicitly endorses the apparent consequence that the pleasure or judgment must involve a claim to its own universal communicability. Since then, several commentators have read the relevant paragraphs of Ferber 9 as requiring some kind of two-acts view, and at the very least as distinguishing the free play of the faculties and pleasure in the beautiful from the judgment of taste proper. This requires addressing the textual difficulty just mentioned. Geyer himself proposes disregarding the problematic passage at 5.2.17 since he takes it to indicate the intrusion of an earlier, incompatible theory, 1979, 1997, 139, 140, for a detailed discussion, see Geyer 1982. Allison suggests instead that the passage be amended so that the pleasure is understood as consequent on a universally communicable mental state, rather than on the state's universal communicability, 2001, 115. Objections to the one-act approach have been raised by a number of commentators, in particular Allison, who partly endorses Ginsburg's criticisms of Geyer, but raises difficulties for her reading of Ferber 9, 2001, 113, 115, and, in particular, rejects the self-referential understanding of judgments of beauty as inherently implausible, 2001, 115, Allison objects also that the one-act view fails to accommodate judgments of the ugly. For more on Kant's views on the ugly, see section 2.3.6. Criticisms of Ginsburg's one-act approach are also to be found in Pippin, 1996, Ameriks, 1998, Palmer, 2008, Vandenabili, 2008, Sweet, 2009, Geyer, 2017a, Mackay, 2010 and 2021, and Berger, forthcoming. Ginsburg replies to Geyer's criticism in her 2017. Commentators have suggested a number of models for the feeling of pleasure and its relation to the judgment of beauty that combine features of both the one-act and the two-act view. Beatrice Longaness offers a view which is in partial agreement with Ginsburg's in that it understands pleasure in the beautiful proper as felt in virtue of the subject's awareness of the universal communicability of her mental state in the presented object, thus like the one-act approach, requiring no emendation of furrow 9. However, rather than understand the pleasure as awareness of its own universal communicability, Longaness takes it to be awareness of a prior and independent feeling of pleasure elicited by the free play of the faculties, so that there are two distinct feelings of pleasure involved in judging an object to be beautiful, 2003, 152, 155, 2006, 203, 208. Sethi, 2019 and forthcoming, likewise proposes that there are two distinct feelings, but denies that they are both feelings of pleasure. As on Ginsburg's view, the pleasure is felt in virtue of the subject's claim to the universal communicability of her feeling, but the feeling for which she claims universal communicability is not a feeling of pleasure, but an antecedent, sui generis, feeling of the harmony of the faculties. Hughes, 2017, argues for a single feeling associated with the judgment of beauty, but one which has a dual intentional directedness towards the object and to the activity of the faculties in judging the object. Some commentators have endorsed a one-act approach while, unlike Ginsburg, rejecting the identification of the pleasure and the judgment. These include, for example, Zuckert, 2007a, paragraph 1-2 of Chart 8, and Pollock, 2017, Chart 9. Berger, forthcoming, defends a two-acts view, but her view differs from Geyer's, in that the second act is not one of reflection on the pleasure, but rather of subsumption of the pleasure under the concept of beauty. Kant's notion of the free play of the faculties, sometimes referred to as the harmony of the faculties, or, more accurately, the free harmony of the faculties, is probably the most central notion of his aesthetic theory. But what is it for the faculties of imagination and understanding to be in free play? Kant describes the imagination and understanding in this free play as freely harmonizing, without the imaginations being constrained by the understanding as it is in cognition. Imagination in the free play, he says, conforms to the general conditions for the application of concepts to objects that are presented to our senses, yet without any particular concept being applied, so that imagination conforms to the conditions of understanding without the constraint of particular concepts. Given Kant's view that concepts are, or at least correspond to, rules by which imagination synthesizes or organizes the data of sense perception, this amounts to saying that imagination functions in a rule-governed way but without being governed by any rule in particular. The free play thus manifests, in Kant's terms, free lawfulness or lawfulness without a law. But there is an apparent paradox in these characterizations which is left unaddressed by Kant's own, largely metaphorical, explanations. It is left to commentators to try to explain how such an activity is intelligible and why, if it is indeed intelligible, it should give rise to, or be experienced as, a feeling of pleasure. Some commentators try to make sense of the free play by appealing to the phenomenology of aesthetic experience, for example, to the kind of experience involved in appreciating an abstract painting, where the subject might imaginatively relate the various elements of the painting to one another and perceive them as having an order and unity which is non-conceptual. See, for example, Bell, 1987, 237, and Crowther, 1989, 56. Filieri, 2021, illustrates the free play through the example of an artwork which is representational rather than abstract. Others try to find a place for it in the context of Kant's theory of the imagination as presented in the Critique of Pure Reason. Two contrasting accounts along these lines are offered by Gaia, who identifies the free play with the first two stages of the threefold synthesis described by Kant in the first edition, Transcendental Deduction, Gaia 1979, 1997, 75-76, and of Macreil 1990, 49-58, for whom the free play is an activity of schematizing pure concepts without the involvement of empirical concepts. Ginsburg, 1997a, offers an alternative view of the free play derived from her one-act reading of The Judgment of Taste, see section 2.3.1, on which what it is for the imagination and understanding to be in free play just is for the subject to be in a perceptual state of mind, which involves a non-conceptual claim to its own universal validity with respect to the object perceived. Zinkin, 2006, explains the free play in terms of the common sense, sensus communis, invoked by Kant at Paragraph 20 tons, which he understands as an intensive form of sensibility, in contrast to the extensive forms of sensibility represented by space and time. For more on the common sense, see section 2.3.7. Gorodeisky, 2011, criticizes extra-aesthetic approaches to the free play, which attempt to relate the activity of the faculties in the free play too closely to their activity in cognition, failing to do justice to their distinctly aesthetic character. Ostarik, 2017, makes a related complaint. Williams, 2022, proposes that the free play is to be understood in terms of how attention is guided. In cognition, our attention is guided by cognitive interest. In aesthetics, the subject is guided only by the interests of the imagination, so that the subject has the freedom to let her attention roam. As with the deduction of taste, see section 2.2, a number of commentators have looked to Kant's doctrine of aesthetic ideas, officially part of his account of fine art, to make sense of the free play of the faculties. Examples include Ruger and Evren, 2005, Kalar, 2006, and Chignell, 2007. A particularly detailed and thorough treatment of this approach is offered in Rogerson, 2008. For an earlier and briefer treatment, see Rogerson, 2004. The question of how to understand the free play is complicated by a more general interpretive issue concerning the status of Kant's transcendental psychology. This issue affects not only the interpretation of the free play in the third critique, but also the appeal to activities of imagination and understanding in Kant's account of the conditions of cognition in the first critique, in particular in the metaphysical deduction and the transcendental deduction. Many commentators assume, whether tacitly or explicitly, that the free play of imagination and understanding represents a natural psychological process, taking place in time, and thus subject to natural causal laws. But it is hard to reconcile this understanding of the free play with Kant's appeal to it to justify the legitimacy of judgments of beauty, and more generally, his claim to be offering a transcendental account of judgments of beauty, one which shows such judgments to be founded on an a priori principle. Gaia's approach to the free play from his 1979 onwards has been thoroughly naturalistic. In his 2008, he offers a very explicit defense of this approach, arguing that we should reject Kant's claim to establish an a priori or transcendental principle justifying judgments of beauty, and instead regard Kant's theory of aesthetics as a contribution to the empirical psychology of taste. While this kind of view is rarely explicitly endorsed, many commentators do in fact offer accounts of the free play which at least resemble empirical psychological accounts, raising the question of how Gaia's conclusion is to be avoided. The views touched on in this section represent only a sampling of the various accounts of the free play which have been offered. A useful survey is offered by Gaia, 2006, who classifies various accounts under three heads: precognitive, according to which the play of the faculties is a preconceptual state, falling short of cognition, for example, his own 1979 account; multicognitive, in which the free play represents the playful application of a multiplicity of concepts, and thus a kind of cognitive excess, for example, Allison 2001, and metacognitive, in which the manifold is represented as having a unity which goes beyond what is required for cognition. Gaia's own view in his 2006, in contrast to that of his 1979, favors the latter approach. Gaia 2009 discusses a further variety of approaches. More recent discussions include Gorodetzky 2010-2011, Mathern 2014, Kuplan 2015, Ostarik 2017, and Filieri 2021, 3.3. The intentionality of the pleasure. Does the feeling of pleasure in a judgment of taste have intentional content? According to Gaia, the answer is no. See especially 1979, 1997, 88-97. Although Kant sometimes describes the pleasure as awareness of the free play of the faculties, Gaia takes the relation between the free play and the feeling of pleasure to be merely causal. The pleasure is opaque, or lacks intentional content. While one can come to recognize that one's feeling of pleasure is due to the free play, this is not because the pleasure makes one immediately aware of it, but rather because reflection on the causal history of one's pleasure can lead one to conclude that it was not sensory or due to the satisfaction of a desire, and hence, by elimination, must have been due to the free play. While some commentators have shared Gaia's view that the pleasure is opaque, and hence that having a feeling of pleasure does not enable us to know what kind of pleasure we are feeling, see e.g. Mathern, 2019, 9-10. Others have argued for the intentionality of the pleasure, holding that the pleasure is intentionally directed towards the object, or towards its formal structure, Aquila, 1982, or that it makes us aware of the free play, Allison, 2001, in particular, 53-54 and 122-123. Hughes, 2017, argues that it is intentionally directed both to the object perceived as beautiful and to the activity of the faculties in their free play. Zuckert, 2002, argues that for Kant, pleasure in general, and not just pleasure in the beautiful, is intentional in that it makes us aware of our wanting to continue in our mental state, that of feeling of the pleasure. Zuckert develops the argument further in her 2007a, Chapter 6. Kvejic, 2021, agrees with Zuckert that pleasure is intentional, but argues that the intentionality is of a distinctive kind, characteristic only of feelings, and unlike the intentionality of cognitive representations. A. Cohen, 2020, also argues that pleasure in the beautiful and feelings more generally for Kant are intentional, but she denies that the intentionality is intrinsic, taking it rather to be derived from our reflective interpretation of those feelings. Cohen's view is discussed in Merritt 2021 and Aaron 2021.2.3.4, the character of the claim to agreement. What kind of claim to agreement is made by a judgment of taste? Kant seems to suggest that a judgment of taste demands agreement in the same way that an objective cognitive judgment demands agreement. See, e.g., Introduction 7, 191 and Per 6, 211. Just as in claiming that a perceived object is green or square. I take it that everyone else ought to share my judgment that the object is green or square. So, in judging an object to be beautiful, I claim that all other perceivers of the object should find it beautiful too. But even if this is granted, one might still raise questions about the character of the demand, either because there are in turn questions to be raised about what it is for a cognitive judgment to claim agreement, or because it is not clear that the claim can in fact be the same, given that in the aesthetic case one is claiming that others share one's feeling, as opposed to demanding that they apply the same concept to the object. Gaia, 1979, argues that the claim should be understood as a rational expectation or ideal prediction rather than as a normative demand. Someone who judges an object to be beautiful is claiming that under ideal circumstances everyone will share her pleasure, 1979, 1997, 123, 130, and 144, 147. Saville, 1987, and Chignell, 2007, follow Gaia in understanding the claim in this way. Harbin, 2020. While not endorsing the ideal prediction interpretation proposed by Gaia, agrees with him in rejecting the view that judgments of beauty make a genuinely normative claim on others' agreement. Felodge, 2020, holds a similar view. Harbin's argument is challenged in Dunn, 2020. Gaia's understanding of the claim to agreement made by a judgment of beauty has been criticized by a number of commentators, including Rogerson, 1982, Ginsburg, 1998, Ichor, Rand, 2002, and Kalar, 2006, Chuach 1. A basic difficulty is that it apparently fails to do justice to the normative language used by Kant to describe the demand. For example, that anyone who declares something to be beautiful holds that everyone ought to, solemn, give his approval to the object and likewise declare it beautiful, February 19, 5, 237. Chauli 2017 surveys the various normative terms used by Kant in this connection and discusses their significance. See Cheong 3, 51-53. Rogerson proposes instead that a judgment of beauty makes a moral demand on others to appreciate the object's beauty, so that the ought is to be understood as rational, and more specifically moral, rather than merely predictive. The other critics mentioned take the ought and the corresponding claim to agreement to be non-moral, yet still genuinely normative as opposed to predictive. A view of this kind is assumed, with varying degrees of explicitness, by a number of other commentators, including Allison, 2001, see especially 159 and 178, 179, 2006, 132. But this approach, which is perhaps closest to the letter of Kant's text, raises a question. What kind of normativity is this, if not that associated with morality, or more generally, practical rationality? It is tempting to assimilate it to cognitive or epistemic normativity, where this in turn might be understood as the normativity involved in the putative principles that one ought to believe what is true, or alternatively, what is justified in light of the evidence. However, this appears to conflict with Kant's commitment to the subjectivity and, relatedly, non-conceptuality of judgments of taste. To avoid the conflict, while preserving the link Kant seems to assert between the normativity of aesthetic judgment and that of cognitive judgment, we need an understanding of the normativity such that it is a necessary condition of cognition that we be able to make such normative demands for agreement, yet without the normativity simply being identified with the cognitive or epistemic normativity associated with truth and justification. Ginsburg, 2006, identifies it with what she calls the primitive normativity required for empirical conceptualization. Our grasp of empirical concepts depends on the possibility of making such primitively normative claims, but they do not, in turn, presuppose cognition, which leaves open the possibility that such a claim is implicit in aesthetic experience and judgment. Granted, pace Gaia, that the claim is normative without being moral, further questions can be raised about its strength and character. Moran, 2012, understands the demand as reflecting a sense of obligation or requirement, distinct from moral obligation but stronger than that present in the case of empirical cognitive judgment. He reads Kant as drawn towards a view on which the beautiful object itself makes an unconditional demand on the viewer's attention, of a kind made vivid in the narrator's vow to the hawthorns in Proust's In Search of Lost Time, although he also takes Kant's denial of the objectivity of taste to debar him from endorsing such a view. A similar suggestion is made in Mackay, 2010. She takes Kant to hint at the idea that the beautiful object is found to deserve, or call for, recognition as beautiful, where this implies a claim on the viewer which goes beyond any claim implicit in an objective judgment. Roughly, on the view suggested by Moran and Mackay, the claim implicit in a judgment of beauty is not merely the conditional claim that others, if they perceive the object, ought to judge it to be beautiful. It is the unconditional claim that others ought to perceive it, and in so doing, judge it to be beautiful. The idea that Kant takes us to be subject to a demand to attend to beautiful objects is also put forward in Kala 2006. But Kala understands that demand as one of two distinct normative demands made in the judgment of beauty, a non-moral demand to feel pleasure in the given object, and a further moral demand to attend to the object, 2006 too. Mackay, 2021, develops further the view that the object has a claim on us, although she does not see it as a moral claim. Lopez, 2021, seems also to assume such a claim. 3.5. Is beauty objective? Should judgments of beauty be regarded as objective? Amerix has argued 1982, 1983, 1998, 2000 that in spite of Kant's claim that judgments of beauty are subjectively grounded, they are nonetheless objective in the same sense that judgments of color and other secondary qualities are objective. Similar views are proposed in Savile 1981 and Kuhlenkampf 1990. See also the references offered by Amerix at 2003, 307-1. The claim is challenged by Ginzburg, 1998, who defends the subjectivity of taste on the grounds that Kant does not allow that we can make judgments of beauty on the basis of hearsay, but must subject the object to our own eyes. Parent 8, 5 and 215, 216. A similar point is made in Hopkins 2001, and there is further discussion of aesthetic testimony in Gorodeisky 2009. Amerix responds to Ginzburg's challenge in his 1998. The objectivity of taste is defended further in Mackay 2010. Ginzburg offers further defense of the subjectivity of taste in her 2017. Her approach is challenged in Chapter 3 of Mackay 2021. The question of whether Kant should be interpreted as committed to the objectivity of taste is closely related to the question of whether there can be erroneous judgments of taste. For some discussion, see T. Cohen, 1982, 222-226, and Allison, 2001, 107-108. It is also related to the question of aesthetic normativity, see section 2.3.4 above, and to that of the autonomy of taste, the supposed independence of our judgments of taste both from testimony and from the judgments of experts, which is discussed in Mathern 2019, Ton 2, 3.6, Negative Judgments of Beauty. Kant's discussion of judgments of beauty focuses almost exclusively on the positive judgment that an object is beautiful, and relatedly of the feeling of pleasure in a beautiful object. He has very little to say about the judgment that an object is not beautiful, or about the displeasure associated with judging an object to be ugly. As noted in section 2.7 below, he does take the appreciation of the sublime to involve a kind of displeasure, but this seems to be a different kind from the displeasure that might be involved in judging something to be ugly. Does his treatment allow for negative judgments of beauty, either that an object is not beautiful or that it is ugly? Shire, 1998, argues that it does not, but this has been challenged by Allison, 2001, who takes it to be a criterion for a satisfactory interpretation of Kant's theory of taste, that it allow for negative judgments of beauty, 2001, 72, see also 184, 186. Others who have emphasized the need to consider the role of the ugly in Kant's account of aesthetics include Hudson, 1991, Wenzel, 1999, and Kuplan, 2015. It is useful, in considering this topic, to distinguish the question of how we can judge that something is not beautiful from that of how we can judge it to be ugly. The former question can be seen an aspect of a more general problem about how we can make judgments in which ascriptions of beauty figure in embedded contexts, for example, as the antecedents of conditionals. This is akin to what is often referred to as the Frege-Geach problem for expressivist accounts of normative discourse. The second question is more specific and can be framed in terms of aesthetic experience. Can Kant allow for an experience of displeasure in the ugly? And if he can, is it symmetrical with pleasure in the beautiful? Some commentators, for example, Brandt, 1994, Ginsburg, 2003, 175, 177, and Geyer, 2005b, Cheechage 6, have denied that there is such a thing for Kant as pure displeasure in the ugly, or, correlatively, a pure judgment of ugliness. Geyer argues that while there is displeasure in the ugly, it always involves an interest. Ginsburg allows also for disinterested judgments of ugliness, but denies that these involve a characteristic feeling of displeasure. Rather, we judge that something is ugly if it lacks beauty in a context where beauty is expected. More generally, on her view, aside from cases where the judgment is based on perception of an object as harmful or disgusting, judgments of the ugly depend on recognition of the context in which the object is presented. Gracick defends a similar point, using it to argue that ugly objects are those which resist unification and are thus less pleasurable to perceive than other objects, 1986, 55. Geyer's view is criticized in McConnell 2008, which offers a useful survey of previous discussions of the issue, and partly drawing on Gracick 1986, provides a defense of pure judgments of ugliness which appeals to Kant's theory of aesthetic ideas. A. Cohen, 2013, suggests that there can be both impure and pure judgments of ugliness, arguing for the possibility of a foul play of the faculties in which the play of imagination and understanding is hindered rather than facilitated, and stand in reciprocal disharmony. 7. What is the common sense? In the fourth moment of the Analytic of the Beautiful, at paragraph 20, Kant claims that judgments of taste rely on a subjective principle which determines only by feeling rather than concepts, and that such a principle must be regarded as a common sense. Sensus communis, paragraph 20, 238. He goes on, at paragraph 21, in an argument often regarded as anticipating the deduction of taste at paragraph 38, to argue that we must assume a common sense as a condition of the universal communicability of cognition. But in order to make sense of the argument, we must be able to understand Kant's notion of a common sense, and this proves to be challenging. In particular, if the common sense introduced at paragraph 20 is a principle for judging by feeling, then, assuming with most commentators that what Kant means by feeling is the feeling of pleasure, it seems implausible to suppose that it is a condition for claiming the universal communicability or universal validity of our cognitive judgments. For it seems that we do not need to feel pleasure in order to determine, in the case of a cognitive judgment, whether it is one that everyone else should share. This raises the question whether the notion of common sense, to which Kant also returns in paragraph 40, is in fact univocal, or whether, as proposed by Allison, there are two different species of common sense, one required for the universal communicability of judgments of beauty, and one required for the universal communicability of cognition. A second question associated with the notion of a common sense, raised by Geyer, 1979, 1997, 249-250, and discussed recently in Matern, is that of its ontological status, given that Kant refers to it variously as a feeling, a principle, and a faculty. A third question, discussed in detail by Geyer, 1979, 1997, 264, 273, and Matern, is raised by Kant himself in paragraph 22, whether the common sense, understood as a principle or standard, is regulative or constitutive. This question, which Kant leaves unanswered, is especially puzzling because it appears from paragraph 21 that Kant already takes himself to have established that the common sense is a condition of the universal communicability of cognition. Following, Geyer's own assessment of the common sense as an unnecessary detour, 1979, 1997, 274, in the overall argument of the deduction, many commentators have disregarded the common sense in their discussions of Kant's theory of taste. Recently, however, there has been much more attention to the notion of the common sense. Mathern, who follows Allison in distinguishing an aesthetic from a cognitive common sense, takes aesthetic common sense as something that we acquire, thus, as regulative rather than constitutive, and invokes it to help make sense of Kant's view that taste is autonomous. Mackay, 2021, Chorse 4, examines and rejects Allison's distinction between an aesthetic and cognitive common sense, arguing that Prober 21 points to a parallel between cognition and taste in that both require a feeling of what calls for judging, or what matters, 159. Sethi, forthcoming, also rejects the distinction, pointing out that the need for it is premised on the assumption that the feeling invoked at Prober 20 must be a feeling of pleasure, and arguing, drawing in part on Sethi 2019, that the feeling of the free play of the faculties is not a feeling of pleasure, see section 2.31. She takes the common sense to be necessary for empirical concept acquisition, so that the notion of common sense plays a crucial role in accounting for the relation between taste and cognition. 8. Universal validity and universal communicability. Kant describes judgments of beauty both as universally valid and as universally communicable. Many commentators have treated these expressions as more or less equivalent, and Gaia, 1979, 1997, 251, 252, points out several passages where Kant seems to use them interchangeably. For the most part, this article follows this way of understanding the expressions. However, several commentators have argued recently that it is important to distinguish these two notions. The universal communicability of a judgment of beauty is not just a matter of its claiming universal validity, but has to do with the possibility of literally communicating our feeling in the object, for example, bringing it about that another person can share it. Commentators who have emphasized this distinction include Mackay, 2021, Chiat 2, Vaccarino Bremner, forthcoming, and Sethi, forthcoming. 4. Judgments of beauty, some criticisms. As noted at the end of section 2.2, Kant's account of judgments of beauty has been criticized on the grounds that the argument for their universal validity, that is, the deduction of pure aesthetic judgments, is unsuccessful. Criticisms have also been raised against various aspects of Kant's characterization of judgments of beauty in the Analytic of the Beautiful. Objections have been raised in particular to Kant's view that judgments of beauty are disinterested, and to his supposed commitment to aesthetic formalism, the view that all that matters for aesthetic appreciation is the abstract formal pattern, manifested by the object, that is, the way in which its elements are interrelated in space and/or time. For discussion of the questions of disinterestedness and formalism, see Gaia, 1979, 1997, Chiest 5 and 6, and Allison, 2001, Chiest 4 and 5. Zuckert offers a sympathetic reading of Kant's formalism, 2007a, 182, 189. Kant's formalism was particularly influential via the influence of Hanslick in musical theory. For discussion, see Kivy, 2009, Shirt 2. Discussions of this topic often note that although the Analytic of the Beautiful puts forward a formalist view, Kant's treatment of aesthetic ideas, discussed in section 2.6, is more congenial to an expressivist view of art. Typically, objections to Kant's view of pleasure as disinterested appeal to the apparently obvious fact that we do in fact take an interest in the preservation of beautiful objects. See, for example, Crawford, 1974, 53. A different kind of objection, based on an appeal to the cognitive role of aesthetic judging, is made in Pillow, 2006. Kant has also been criticized for a view that is taken to be a consequence of the thesis that judgments of beauty are disinterested, namely the view that aesthetic experience requires a special attitude of psychical distance or detachment from the object appreciated. This criticism is generally taken to be implicit in Dickey's well-known 1964 discussion of the myth of the aesthetic attitude. Zangwill, 1992, argues that this criticism is misplaced. Kant's view that the pleasure in a beautiful object is non-conceptual has been taken to commit him to the supposedly objectionable view that the capacity to make conceptual distinctions can play no role in the appreciation of beauty. This criticism, made by Wollheim, 1980, invoking the idea that aesthetic appreciation demands an empty cognitive stock, is addressed in Janaway, 1997. Relatedly, it has been objected that Kant does not allow room for reason-giving and, more generally, criticism in aesthetics. That objection is addressed in Crawford 1970 and, on lines suggested by Crawford, in Wilson 2007. Further defense and explication of a Kantian approach to art criticism is offered in Tuner 2016. Baz, 2005, criticizes Kant for his apparent view that the value of beauty lies in its relation to cognition rather than the beautiful object's mattering for its own sake. Hughes, 2006, offers a response. Free and adherent beauty. This article, so far, has been concerned primarily with pure judgments of beauty. But Kant also allows for judgments of beauty which are not pure. Judgments of beauty can fail to be pure in two ways. They can be influenced by the object's sensory or emotional appeal, that is. They can involve charm, Reiz, or emotion, Rührung, Brad of 13. They can be contingent on a certain concepts applying to the object, so that the object is judged, not as beautiful tout court, but as beautiful qua belonging to this or that kind. The second kind of impurity is discussed in paragraph 16 in connection with the distinction between free, frei beauty and adherent, or dependent, anhängend, beauty. One reason to think that the distinction is important is that Kant seems to suggest that all judgments of beauty about representational art are judgments of adherent rather than of free beauty, and hence that they are all impure. This is questioned by Tuner, 2018, who holds that works of art, which result from genius, can be regarded as instances of free rather than adherent beauty. While some artworks can be free beauties, the examples Kant gives are all of non-representational art, designs à la grecque, foliage for borders or on wallpaper, fantasias in music, and indeed, Kant adds, all music without a text, paragraph 16, 229. It might be supposed from this that Kant's core account of judgments of beauty is only peripherally applicable to art, which would make it largely irrelevant to the concerns of contemporary aesthetics. However, this consequence is debatable. For example, Allison argues that judgments of adherent beauty contain, as a component, a pure judgment of beauty. The purity of this core judgment is not undermined by its figuring in a more complex evaluation, which takes into account the objects falling under a concept, 2001, 140-141. Kant's suggestion that representational art has adherent rather than free beauty, and that judgments about such art fail to be pure, might also invite the objection that Kant takes non-representational art to be superior to representational art, so that, say, wallpaper designs are aesthetically more valuable than the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. This objection is challenged by Schaper, 1979, Ch. 4, reprinted in Gaia 2003a, and by Gaia, 2005b, Sheet 4 and 5. Tuner, 2018, adopts a different approach to the underlying problem by arguing that works of art, if they are works of genius, should not be viewed as cases of adherent beauty in the first place. Further discussions of the distinction between free and adherent beauty include Skara, 1981, Lorand, 1989, Gammon, 1999, Gaia, 2002a, Kalar, 2006, 82-89, Zuckert, 2007a, 202, 212, and Ruger, 2008. Cluis, 2018, provides useful historical context for the distinction.